Now, setting up links like this is nice, but often you also want to give the user some feedback regarding which link is currently active. Here, for example, it would be nice if the active user would be highlighted. And we can highlight a link here by giving it the selected class. That's a CSS class I prepared in advance. But of course, hard coding is no option, because then all the users would be hard coded. So instead, we want to set it dynamically. Now, you could try to bind this selected class dynamically and come up with some code here where you take a look at the URL and whatever, but that is actually not something you have to do. Instead, Angular gives you another directive which you can add to your elements, which would be the router link active directive, which allows you to define a CSS class that should be applied to this element if it is the element that led to the currently active route being loaded. And in my case here, I want to add the selected CSS class to this anchor element if this anchor element leads to the currently active route. Now, router link active is a separate directive, which must therefore be added to this imports array, like this. And if you do that and save that, you'll see that again, all these users are marked as active. And the reason for that is, of course, that currently all users do render exactly the same link that leads to exactly the same route, to /tasks, which is the route that is currently active. So it makes sense that all these links are marked as being active. But that will get fixed soon, because that isn't the behavior I want anyways. Instead, clicking on different users should of course load tasks, but it should load tasks for the selected user. So what we actually might want to do here is incorporate the ID of the user for whom we clicked on a link into this path. And we want to set up a route that allows us to encode dynamic information into the path so that we can set up one route that will load one component that will then still allow us to actually show different data for different users. Put in other words, we want to set up a dynamic route, and that's what we'll do in the next lectures. So in order to load the same tasks component with different data for different users, I want to make sure that the user ID is actually encoded in the path up here. So that we, for example, navigate to /users/u3/tasks. And the goal then would be to load the tasks component, but in that component, we should then be able to extract that user ID to then fetch the tasks for the user for whom the component was loaded, so that we can reuse the route configuration and component and still work with different data for different routes or for different paths. And that's actually a very common requirement, which is why Angular's router, like most routers of any framework, allows you to configure so-called dynamic routes, which are routes where at least parts of the path are dynamic and not hard-coded. So here I'll actually replace my tasks route here with a new route where I'll set the path to users/ let's say :user ID. And this part here, :user ID, would now be a dynamic path segment. Now, just to be clear, you don't need users/ here. You could also set up a dynamic path like this. So it may consist of only the dynamic path segment. But here I actually want to prefix it with users/ so that this becomes active for your domain /users/ and then any user ID of your choice. So for example, 1 or 5 or 10 or ABC or U1 or whatever value can be used as a user ID. So that's the idea behind this kind of path. That sets up a dynamic route because we have a dynamic path segment in here. And you could have multiple dynamic path segments in a single route if you needed them, but here I'm fine with just the user ID. It's also worth noting that this identifier after the colon is entirely up to you. You could also use UID here, or just U, or just ID, or whatever you want, but we'll later need this placeholder here, this identifier, to extract the actual user ID from the URL so that we can then load the right data for the selected user. But it is up to you how you name this. This colon, on the other hand, is required because that is what tells Angular that you have a dynamic segment here. Well, and besides that, this route is then still set up as before. You define the component that should be loaded for this user ID. And here I'll actually load a different component, a user tasks component, which I also prepared in advance. We'll load the tasks component again later, but for the moment I'll load the user tasks component here. And this is a component you find in the users folder, there, user tasks. And the goal here is to have some shared header for all users, and then below that I later want to output the different user-specific tasks. For the moment, it'll be of course the same content that will be displayed for all users, but we'll soon customize this content. Nonetheless, we now got a dynamic route here, and we therefore now have to go to our user component where we have this link, and we have to make sure that we navigate to this dynamic route here. Because going to /tasks won't do anything anymore because we have no /tasks route anymore. So instead we want to go to /users and then the ID of the user for whom this user component is being rendered. Because keep in mind that we get the user as an input here. Here as a signal input, but of course it would be the same if you would get it with the input decorator. So we want to construct this router link dynamically here, and therefore we need, you guessed it, property binding. And you can now set this in different ways. You could, for example, construct a string dynamically here and go to /users and then concatenate user ID like this. That would overall set the router link to a string that contains /users / and then the ID of the user. This / here is important, by the way. But alternatively, Angular also allows you to construct this router link path in a different way if you need to set it dynamically, because Angular also allows you to pass an array as a value for the router link directive, instead of passing a string. And that array then simply allows you to define the different path segments as different array elements. So for example, the first segment could be /users, so this hard-coded string. But the second segment then could be user ID. And the / after /users would be inserted automatically by Angular because it will basically concatenate these route segments by inserting slashes between them. So that's a different notation, which you'll also see quite a bit. And with that, if we save that, you will see that if you now hover over these different users, a different path shows up in the bottom left corner. And if you click on a user, this path here is loaded or is added to the URL. And it's now only this user that's marked as active because every user item here now has a different path. As you can see, if you watch this URL, you see the user ID changes as I switch between different users. And that's therefore how you can set up and use dynamic routes. As a next step, it would of course be great if we could go to the user tasks component, which is the component that is loaded with this dynamic route. And in there, I now want to output a different user name for every user. So that's what we'll do next.